Welcome. I'm excited to see you all here this morning. We had a full house yesterday as well, and we have a lot to go over in the brief amount of time that we have together. So really, with this particular training, typically this is a 4-hour training, and we've kind of pared it down to 2. So we've just got a ton of content to go over, and I apologize in advance if we don't get to everything. With that being said, you are more than welcome to ask questions, make comments throughout. I'd rather have this be as meaningful as possible than just simply get through every single slide. So you can see up here that we really have 3 main objectives for our time together this morning. And one is that we want to have a common understanding of what it is we mean when we're talking about culture, and we want to be able to conceptualize that in a way that it's as comprehensive as possible. 2, we want to understand how culture really impacts our day-to-day professional lives and the ways in which we serve others. And 3, we want to understand how being culturally responsive lends itself to improving client outcomes across the board. So that's my hope, that you walk away today with those 3 objectives being accomplished. So with that, when we talk about culture, we really want to conceptualize each and every one of our individual cultural identities as sort of similar to how you would conceptualize an iceberg. So what do we know about icebergs in general? And you can just yell out if you want.
Took out the Titanic.
Took out the Titanic, the powerful, right?
Not bigger under the water than above the water.
Right, the bulk of them lies beneath the surface, right? We can't necessarily know how big an iceberg is just by looking at what lies above the surface. And so when we think about each one of our cultural identities, they're very similar to an iceberg in that if we were to pass one another on the street, just kind of quickly glance at one another, we wouldn't necessarily be able to tell a whole lot about each other just by a quick look. And so if you were to think of yourself, your own cultural identity, what are some of the things that lie above the surface? What would we be able to guess just by looking at you?
Point.
What was that?
Point.
Okay, so we might guess color. So race, ethnicity, maybe. Age. Okay, what else?
Gender identity.
Yeah, so we might make some guesses about gender identity. What else?
Based on the way we dress.
Yeah, so we might look at overall appearance and make some guesses about socioeconomic status, maybe profession, but not a whole lot, right? So, and those things that we've mentioned, those would be guesses. So we would take a quick glance, make some guesses, and we may or may not be right about some of those things. So if you were to think about other aspects of your cultural identity that lie beneath the surface, what are some of those things? What couldn't I guess about you just by looking at you?
Language.
Yeah, your preferred language, primary language spoken.
Religion.
Religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs. Heritage. So, and then traditions, values, morals. Yeah, life experiences, past trauma. What else? Political affiliations and other affiliations. So other organizational groups you might identify with.
Maybe your health.
Yeah, health, abilities. What else?
Sexual preference.
Yeah, sexual orientation. Someone mentioned earlier gender identity above the surface, but we wouldn't necessarily know that. Your migration history, so how you came to be where you are. We wouldn't necessarily know about your family of origin, your birth order, who comprised your family of origin, what your chosen family looks like now. We wouldn't know all of those familial roles that you play. What else? So all of these things and more really contribute to our individual cultural identities. And so when we think about culture, we want to consider these particular aspects, but what I'd like us to do is take a few minutes where we'll have you partner up with someone who's sitting nearby you, and we're going to do an activity that's called a cultural introduction. So what I'd like you to do is take turns where one of you will be the speaker, and the other will be the listener, and there's a couple rules to this. So one, you'll describe yourself culturally, whatever you'd like to include in that, and there's never an expectation that you self-disclose, so if you'd rather maybe role play a client that you work with, that's fine too. So as the speaker, you'll share cultural identity, and one of the rules with that is you can't talk about what you do for a living, which the person next to you probably already knows, but you can't talk about what you do for a living or your educational background. And for the listener, the one rule is you can't ask any follow-up questions. You just have to listen. So let's take a couple minutes. We'll have one of you go first, and then in maybe 3-4 minutes, we'll have you switch. Okay. In the interest of time, I want us to come back together as a larger group. And so I'd like to hear from folks about what it was like describing yourself culturally. Uncomfortable. For what reason?
Just opening up.
Okay, yeah. So there's some vulnerability that goes along with that.
Oh, weird. Well, I think it's because I'm next to people I know, and so I was just like, I'll tell you everything.
Okay, so if you already knew the people next to you, then
Yeah.
then it didn't necessarily feel as threatening.
Yeah.
Oh, and we may have lost. Oh. Okay. What about for other folks?
Kind of hot seat effect, makes you think about yourself.
Yeah, you're in the hot seat. And a lot of times folks will say, well, I didn't know what to say or what to say first, or I wasn't sure if I should share this particular aspect about myself because without context, I didn't know how this other person would really interpret the information or take the information. So how many folks felt like, I'll share these things, but I'm not sharing these other things? How many folks had that experience? So yeah, and so it really does kind of put us on the spot when we're asked directly to describe ourselves culturally. And one of the rules was you weren't allowed to talk about what you do for a living. What was it like talking about yourself without talking about that aspect? Yeah. Okay, so someone said difficult. I think someone else said maybe easier. Yeah.
Difficult because day to day you don't really think about like your roots.
Mm-hmm.
You have to kind of dig in to really think about, your family. Because you just don't think about it. You're thinking about carrying out your job.
Yeah, because day to day, what she had said is that you're not really thinking about your roots, you're just sort of going through your day-to-day job duties. And so we take out that particular aspect of describing ourselves because a lot of times it can be sort of a surface level way of giving folks information about ourselves without necessarily revealing too much. And so you think about if you go to a social gathering or a barbecue, something like that, people say, oh, what's your name? Oh, what do you do for a living? And so when you say that, it gives some information about maybe education, socioeconomic status, interests, those kinds of things, but it allows us to kind of keep the rest of the information about ourselves kind of more confidential. And so we take that part out simply because then we're kind of forced to look at maybe more of the those pieces about ourselves and our cultural identity that we don't typically think to share initially. So what was it like being the listener without asking questions? Okay. What did you want to ask? So,
About traditions and other kinds of things related to their
yeah, some things were interesting. We wanted to know more. And so we take that piece out because we want the speaker to be able to share exactly what they want to share without necessarily having to delve into any more information maybe that they weren't intending to share with you. And so it allows the speaker to really kind of navigate what it is they want to talk about. And so we do this particular activity because for many of our agencies throughout the state, so I'm with the Office of Behavioral Health, we oversee mental health and substance use disorder agencies. We require that agencies ask clients about their cultural background, but we also want to have the experience of what it's like when we say, anything culturally about you that I should know about? So we want to know what that's like to be asked that question and kind of think about how that might create some vulnerability for all of us, really. So when we think about culture, with the various cultural identity factors that we've already mentioned, we want to keep in mind that each one of our individual cultural identities changes over the course of a lifespan. So how I identified 10, 20, 30 years ago is not necessarily how I identify today, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and so on. Because some of those factors that we mentioned can change over time. So socioeconomic status can change over time. Your education level can change over time. Your physical abilities, cognitive abilities can change over time. What our family looks like changes over time. Organizational affiliations, kind of so on and so forth. So our migration history, all of these things are contextual. And so it's important to consider that when we're talking with an individual about their present cultural identity, we may also want to know what it looked like in the past so that we have a better sense of how they've arrived at who they are today. We also want to recognize that culture is socially constructed. It's contextual in terms of who we surround ourselves with and the location we find ourselves in. And so when we think about culture in those terms and how it can be ever evolving over time, it becomes that much more difficult to really conceptualize what it means for each and every one of us, because then we have to consider all of the different individual experiences that a person can have. So with that, culture is considered to be one of the most difficult terms to define worldwide. And so I always like to share the Merriam-Webster definition of culture because I just think this is helpful. So Merriam-Webster defines it as an integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior that depends upon the capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. I don't know about you, but that really helps me. That makes it really crystal clear. So, and I share that just to say, just to demonstrate kind of how difficult it can be to define it in a way that's meaningful and sensical. And so with that, we also want to understand how we separately and distinctly define ethnicity. So how would you differently define ethnicity from culture? What was that?
Culture is what you are now. Ethnicity is place of origin.
Okay, so he had said culture is what you are now and ethnicity is your place of origin. So ethnicity comes from the Greek term ethnos, which means a group of people that all originated from the same location. And so if you've got a group of people originating from the same location, what you've then got also is shared DNA. And so ethnicity is a foundational piece of each and every one of our cultural identities, in that our DNA is rooted in our ethnicity. And when we have different ethnic groups that originate from different locations, typically there are some shared cultural factors among that ethnic group. So you might have shared traditions, shared values and beliefs, maybe some shared religious views, shared practices around food, clothing, music, traditions, celebrations, those kinds of things. So when we think about ethnicity, again, we want to consider it a foundational piece of cultural identity. So while some of those other cultural identity factors can change over time, ethnicity certainly won't. And so we do have some cultural basis in ethnicity. So that's how we want to kind of separately understand it in relation to how we conceptualize culture. So aside from that, how would we define race?
Well, it's more socially constructed. It's like categorical. You have multiple
Mhm.
ethnicities belonging to a certain race, but not
Yeah, absolutely. So race is a man-made construct designed to categorize humans based on 3 traits. So based on skin color, eye shape, and nose shape. And that's all that race is. So when we think about talking with individuals about cultural identity, we want to make sure that if we're asking questions about race, ethnicity, that race is really only going to give us that, how someone would be categorized based on those 3 physical characteristics. Okay. So why do we want to cover this? Why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons, but certainly we know that we live in a diverse community, a diverse country that's growing increasingly more so. And as a large human services organization, we want to make sure that the services that are provided speak to everyone in the community rather than maybe a portion of the community. So I've just got some statistics up there, and this PowerPoint is available electronically, but I won't read slides to you because that's painful. So let's talk about how cultural identity is developed for each one of us and over time, over the course of a lifespan. So a lot of the information in these slides comes from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and so this is one of the models that they suggest is how cultural identity development occurs for each of us. And so you see there's 5 stages up here, and it's important to keep in mind that this doesn't occur sort of as a linear progression. It's more of a pendulum swinging. So these stages could be applied to any point in the lifespan. So for example, if you think about babies, toddlers, kind of going through these stages, stage 1 is conformity, where you're just trying to figure out how do you exist and fit in your current surroundings or in your dominant culture. So you think about, babies, toddlers, they're trying to learn language skills. If you make a surprised face at a baby, they'll mimic it back. Toddlers going into preschool, they're just trying to figure out how am I supposed to behave when the teacher gives instructions, those kinds of things. So stage 1 is just conforming. We see this occurring for adolescents as they enter into high school. They're just trying to figure out, how do you navigate high school life? How do you find your peer group? Okay, we're all going to show up wearing the same thing. We're all going to listen to the same music. So stage 1 is again, just this conformity. It happens again as we enter into a profession. We're just trying to figure out, how do I navigate my new work life and how do I be successful at this? And so we see this occurring kind of throughout. And then stage 2 is where we feel like we've got a pretty good handle on how we conform to whatever the dominant surroundings suggest we should be doing. But stage 2 is where we might start to open ourselves up to new and different information, and we might start to question what our original dominant culture surroundings dictated to us. So for example, adolescent development, you might see that a child has tended to listen to their parents throughout most of their life until they hit adolescence, and then all of a sudden their parents are still trying to instill values, rules, structure, and then the adolescent might say, wait a second, but my friends all get to do this, and I would actually prefer to do that, so I'm going to push back on whatever it is you dictate I should be doing. We see this when people make changes in terms of career or various affiliations that they want to become a part of. So for folks who have ever worked in criminal justice, we see this as someone decides to enter into a criminal culture or a gang culture or a drug culture, and then we also see this dissonance happening, this struggle about kind of straddling the line, so to speak, in terms of what they want to believe when someone is choosing to become sober or leave a gang culture, kind of so on and so forth. Stage 3 is where, and again, this is where that pendulum swings. So stage 3 is where we may have opened ourselves up to new information, but we decide that we want to double down or dig in on our culture of origin. So stage 3 is where you might hear people making really egocentric or ethnocentric types of remarks. So when someone is in stage 3, not only are they kind of fully adhering to whatever their dominant culture is dictating to them, but you might even hear them making statements where they are prioritizing cultures and seeing their culture as superior, that my way is the best way, it's the preferred way, and is certainly better than how I might view other cultures. So we see sometimes people will get stuck in stage 3 with this sense of kind of superiority. And we know there's a psychological cost to that. But from this stage, a lot of times folks will then move into stage 4, which is introspection, where there is more of a shared appreciation for one's own cultural identity, as well as cultural identities that they recognize exist around them. And then stage 5 is where someone has kind of arrived at maybe making adjustments to an aspect of their cultural identity. They've arrived at making a different decision maybe about values or morals or affiliations, those kinds of things. And then again, this whole cycle can repeat over the lifespan very many times. So any questions about that? Okay. Okay, so also with talking about culture and cultural identity development, it's important to touch on this topic of intersectionality. How many folks have heard this term? So this is a term that really speaks to the idea that once we have an understanding of what someone's cultural identity factors are, we then also want to be sure to understand what speaks most to that person. So a person may share information about ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, abilities, migration history, all of these things. And so we might then assume, oh, I bet these things are probably the most important or at the forefront of how this person experiences the world or navigates things. But we want to check in and have an understanding of what an individual believes is most influential or defining in terms of their own cultural identity. Because if we don't have an understanding of that, we may then not respond in a way that's as accurate as possible. So along with that, we also want to understand a couple terms, so acculturation and assimilation. So acculturation is this idea that each and any one of us could up and relocate ourselves to another region, another country, and over time, we would be able to successfully navigate our new surroundings. So we would maybe learn the new primary language spoken to the extent that we could navigate day to day. We could maybe get a job and communicate at work. We could navigate the community, go to the grocery store, things like that. And then at home, we might decide that we want to speak our primary language spoken from where we originated. We may decide that we want to engage in new community activities, traditions, celebrations, but we also might still hang on to and celebrate traditions from where we came from. So we might still say, well, I still want to celebrate 4th of July, Thanksgiving, those kinds of things, even though that might not occur in our new surroundings. This is different from assimilation in that assimilating is where we would up and relocate ourselves, and over time, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that we originated from anywhere else. We might abandon our old primary language spoken, we might change our style of dress, our appearance, we would abandon old traditions, and we would fully adhere to whatever the new dominant culture dictates is most appropriate. And so when we think about acculturation and assimilation, we want to consider ways in which individuals experience a societal expectation that they must acculturate or that they must assimilate or should acculturate or assimilate. Because when that happens, what we do is we create this sense of cultural pain, that there's something inherently wrong or justifiably rejected simply by maintaining your previous cultural identity. And so as individuals working in the helping profession, we want to think about ways in which we operate day to day and how we provide services. And are there any instances in which we might inadvertently be conveying a sense of an expectation around acculturating or assimilating? We want to think about how we make services available in terms of language access, interpretive services, translative services. We want to think about our hours of operation and the ways in which we expect people to show up for services, those kinds of things. Again, because that sense of you must or should acculturate or assimilate then gives folks the message that there's something about them that's inherently wrong. Questions, comments about that? Okay. So I want you to read through this slide, and for folks who can't see up here, there's another screen back there. So just take a minute and kind of read through this. Okay, so some folks may have seen this before. And so how is this scenario possible? Yeah, it's the mom. And so the mom is the surgeon. And a lot of times when we go over this particular scenario, we'll hear folks say, oh, wait a second, maybe that dad was not the dad of that son. It was just another random dad in the accident, and then the son's father was the surgeon. Or we hear people say, well, maybe it's a two-father household. Maybe it was a same-sex couple, and the one father died, and the other father was the surgeon. And so, and then some folks arrive at, well, it was the mom who was the surgeon. But this particular scenario can sometimes reveal for us some assumptions that we might make about gender roles, about professional roles. And so I'd like to go over this particular scenario before we get to this slide, which this is where we're really starting to talk about cultural assumptions and assumptions that we make about one another based off of that sort of surface level, tip of the iceberg cultural identity information we might be gleaning just by taking a quick look. So for those of you who are brave, what are some assumptions you might make about folks in any one of these 5 photos?
Part of the mafia.
So maybe part of the mafia. So, so criminal activity, mafia affiliation.
You can make assumptions about sexual orientation or religious identity in a few of them.
Yeah, so we might make assumptions about sexual orientation, religious affiliation. What else? So the upper left ones are not vegetarians. Any other guesses, things we might know about folks in these photos? Not a whole lot, right? And so when we're asked kind of point blank, what do we know about the folks in these photos, typically we don't want to respond, because if we were to respond, then we would be revealing some assumptions that we're making based, again, off of those sort of tip of the iceberg, quick glance, taking a look at someone, how they're dressed, maybe overall appearance, tattoos, different ornaments, that kind of thing. But we know that we don't necessarily know a whole lot about folks. So with that, one of the activities that I like to do when we're talking about this topic is who's done that activity, 2 truths and a lie? Anyone familiar with this? Okay. So I want maybe one or 2 folks to think about volunteering. So I'll go first. I'll share 3 statements about myself. For those of you who aren't familiar, I'll share 3 statements about myself, and you all will make guesses about which one you think is my lie. And so I won't tell you which one my lie is until the end. So my 3 statements are that I used to deliver Bon Jovi's newspaper. I've been scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef, and 9/11 terrorists sold me cigarettes. So those are my 3 statements. Which one is my lie?
I'm going to say Bon Jovi.
So you think delivering Bon Jovi's newspaper is my lie? For what reason?
I don't think he lives in Colorado. I don't know.
It would have been a long way to deliver that paper, okay? Anyone else think that one's my lie? Okay. What about scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef? Who thinks that one is my lie? For what reason?
I think the other two seem so kind of outlandish that that was.
Okay, so this one seems the most realistic. Okay? Okay?
You're trying to get us, so, yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to trick you. Okay, and who thinks 9/11 terrorists selling me cigarettes is the lie? Okay, for what reason?
You don't look like a smoker. No.
I don't look like a smoker. I don't sound like a smoker. Yeah. Any other guesses about that one being my lie?
How would you know they were 9/11 terrorists?
How would I have even known? Okay. All right, any other guesses? Okay, so my lie is that I've been snorkeling at the Great Barrier Reef, but I haven't been scuba diving there. So I grew up on the Jersey Shore, and you can't tell because I have acculturated to Colorado, and I've lost my accent or concealed it. So growing up on the Jersey Shore in the mid to late 80s, I had a paper route, and we delivered to Bon Jovi's vacation home. And also growing up on the Jersey Shore as a teenager in the mid to late 90s, my friends and I would buy cigarettes at one particular gas station that was known for selling to underage kids. And so then when the towers were hit, actually today is the anniversary, so when the towers were hit, then it came out that the group that was responsible for that they lived and worked at that gas station. They lived above the garage, and they chose that location because it was close to Allaire State Air Park where they were doing their flight lessons, and it took them out over the New York City skyline. So that's how we knew when that documentary came out that it was those guys. So thank you for taking your guesses. And do we have someone who is willing to volunteer 3 statements about themselves? Okay. Do you mind coming up here? Oh, and we've got 2. So we'll do you and then you, if that's okay? All right. Okay, so 3 statements about yourself, and please don't tell us which one the lie is yet.
Okay.
Okay.
The first one is I grew up in a 2-parent household. The second one is I'm the most well-known drag queen in the city. The third one is I am an intermediate level of speaking. I can speak Japanese at an intermediate level.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, so the first one is that you grew up in a 2-parent household. Second one is you said the most well-known drag queen in town. Is that right?
Yeah.
In town. And the third one is that you can speak Japanese at an intermediate level, right? Okay, so what are our guesses? Yes?
2-parent household.
So the guess is the 2-parent household. What makes that one the lie?
Because I've seen you perform, so I know.
Okay, so maybe some existing information, okay? What about some other guesses? Yeah,
Just to be the devil's advocate, I'll say the Japanese thing.
okay.
Yeah.
So speaking Japanese, what would make that one the lie?
I've never heard him do it yet. And
So there may have been claims, but no evidence, okay? All right. Any other guesses about which one the lie might be? Yes.
I think you might be the second well-known.
Okay, so we might have an overinflated sense of self. The claiming to be number 1 might be the lie. Okay? Any other guesses? Okay, which one was your lie?
The first one.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, all right, we've got one more volunteer.
Who cares?
Okay. Okay, so your 3 statements, but don't tell us the lie yet.
My three statements are: I am a first-generation American, I am bilingual, and my family has a super secret guacamole and sugar cookie recipe.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Okay, so you said first generation, okay, and then
Bilingual.
also bilingual, and the third one is the super secret guacamole and sugar cookie recipe. Okay,
It's one cookie, right?
so for clarification, so it's two separate recipes.
Yes,
right?
two
Okay,
separate
two separate recipes. Okay, so who believes the first one is the lie? What makes that one the lie? I saw a hand.
Kara?
I guess it depends on what country you're from, but unless you're from Canada, you've got an awful no accent.
Okay, so we're making guesses based off of overall perceived level of assimilation, okay? What about the second one? Who thinks the second one is the lie, being bilingual? Okay, so it seems like maybe there's some consensus. Folks are thinking that's true. And what about the third one? The super secret recipes. Who thinks that one's the lie? Okay, so with you, there's some uncertainty in the room. Folks are not willing to guess. So which one's your lie?
I'm not bilingual. My mom is from Austria, and about the only thing I can say in German is Neues sprechen Sie Deutsch.
Oh, okay.
That's the
Thank you.
extent.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we do this particular activity because it forces us again to make our guesses based off of assumptions about one another with limited information. And some of you wouldn't, certainly know the folks in the room, but really we have to kind of go based off of just what we've got in front of us. And so when it comes to cultural assumptions, it's important to consider that one, we struggle to want to admit that we make them, and two, we're hardwired to do so. So when it comes to the assumptions we make about one another, it's really something that's ingrained in us as a survival skill, that we needed as a human species to be able to look at another human being or another living thing and make a pretty quick determination about, is this thing safe or is it not safe? And then how are we going to respond to be self-protective? And so over time, as we've evolved, this particular sort of innate trait that we have has not gone away, but we use it now in a different capacity. So we use it now in such a way that we kind of categorize one another and we make assumptions about one another based off of sort of general appearance. And so one of the things that we have to then do is be willing to acknowledge the fact that we make assumptions about one another, because when we try to convince ourselves that we don't, or when we don't want to acknowledge that we have this tendency, we then allow our assumptions to fuel our biases. And so by acknowledging, one, that we're going to make them because we just can't help it, we are then able to better examine them and understand what our assumptions are and how we've arrived at them. So the thing about the assumptions that we make about one another is they're also strengthened by this idea of cognitive dissonance. Who's familiar with this term? So cognitive dissonance is really the tendency that each and every one of us wants to believe that what we already believe is right. And we don't want to believe that what we already believe is wrong. And so we just don't like to think that we go through life operating under false assumptions or wrong beliefs. And so what cognitive dissonance then causes us to do is we only pay attention to information that supports our beliefs, and we tend to ignore or dismiss information that challenges our beliefs. So where do we see evidence of ways in which we as a society kind of dig in on beliefs?
political right now, there's huge dissonance.
Absolutely. So politics, religion, typically whatever we currently believe in those arenas, we could argue from morning till night and we would both walk away thinking that the other doesn't know what they're talking about. And we wouldn't have necessarily made any changes in terms of what each one of us believes. And so we want to recognize how powerful cognitive dissonance is in that it can maintain a set of beliefs throughout the course of a lifespan that it's really difficult to challenge them. It even kind of boils down to seemingly, less important things. Like if you talk to someone about how they feel about dog breeds, if you ever get into a conversation with someone about pit bulls, they're either going to be pro-pit bull or anti-pit bull. And if you're pro-pit bull, you're going to cite every story you ever heard about a pit bull saving a baby from a burning building, or a pit bull helped my grandma across the street. And you're not going to pay attention to any information that might suggest that there are violent tendencies, and vice versa. So with this information, we now know that one, we make assumptions and we don't want to admit it, and not even to ourselves. And two, we then have this tendency to want to continue to take in information that supports our assumptions. So it's important that we examine these tendencies in ourselves, because unless we do so, again, these assumptions will then fuel biases and prejudice that we hold over time. So any questions, comments about that? Some additional terms that I just wanted folks to have. Again, I won't read them to you, but this is all available electronically. And I always like to just kind of go over some of the isms that exist. And we know that any of these isms are really prejudice based off of or because of a particular cultural identity factor. So you've got up here some examples of that. So sexism, racism, ableism, so prejudice or discrimination or kind of setting things up in favor of able-bodied individuals. And there's a couple terms that I want to go over up here. One is gracism. Are folks familiar with gracism? So it's a newer term that kind of has a couple different meanings. One is this very positive, respectful extension of I've kind of got it up here. So this being very positive and equitable in our approach to most folks or all folks. And the other definition of gracism is that someone would be so incredibly nice or overly nice in an effort to demonstrate I'm not a racist. Look at how nice I am to you. I couldn't possibly be a racist, right? And so this idea of gracism can also be interpreted as sort of very patronizing and very disingenuous, sort of inequitable treatment of folks in an effort to present oneself very favorably. The other term I want to go over up here is colorism. Who's heard of colorism? Anyone in the room? So this is a term that really speaks to the idea of power and privilege being afforded to individuals with lighter skin tone, both across races and within races and ethnicities. And so with colorism, we see in a lot of countries that there is an emphasis on skin lightening. So you've got this one ad over here, Glutamax, which is big in the Philippines, which promotes this idea of skin lightening in an effort to be happier. You can kind of see the difference in her facial expressions there. And then over here, this gentleman, 10% lighter, 100% more numbers, that he would be a more desirable person in the event he lightened his skin. And so this idea of colorism, it's important to understand the nuances of it because it's got some historical significance, and then also presently we see how it plays out in media and society in general. So historically, during times of slavery, there was what was called the brown bag test. And so what the brown bag test was is a brown paper bag was used as a cutoff of sorts, that if an individual's skin tone was lighter than that of a brown paper bag and they were a slave, then they would be afforded the quote-unquote privilege of doing things that put them in the eye of the community. So maybe being a housekeeper, or maybe being a caregiver, or maybe running into town on behalf of a slave owner, versus if their skin were darker than that of a brown paper bag, they were given duties that put them outside of the public eye, so maybe more manual labor or field work. With colorism, we see it play out quite a bit in media, and it's important to think about this in terms of how we as agencies advertise, because there's a cutoff. When you look at sort of stock photos of diversity, that you might see diversity across races and ethnicities, but there is a cutoff in terms of skin pigmentation and how dark someone will be reflected in that picture. And so then we want to think about, in terms of advertising, are we seeing evidence of colorism in the ways in which agencies are advertising themselves? So one question that comes up a lot with this is, well, what about tanning? Because tanning kind of flies in the face of colorism, this emphasis on skin lightening, and then you have folks who pursue tanning or looking tan. And so tanning is different from colorism in that it is seen as a sign of socioeconomic status and privilege, because if you have time to engage in leisure activities or go to places where you can lay around in the sun, that's more of a social standing piece, and so that's how that would differ from this idea of colorism. So any questions or comments about that? Okay. Okay, so our next topic is talking about historical trauma. So how would folks define historical trauma?
The Holocaust, this situation, slavery, all of those things where any group of people suffered
Yeah.
traumatic events and loss.
Absolutely. So that's exactly it. So historical trauma is a deep psychological wounding of an entire group of people based off of experiencing a mass atrocity. And so when we think about historical trauma, we think about events like slavery, like the Holocaust, Trail of Tears, kind of the list goes on. When we think about various historical events where this mass atrocity was perpetuated against an entire group, and a lot of times simply because of that group's cultural identity or ethnicity or religious beliefs, and so on and so forth. And so what happens when a group experiences this shared mass atrocity is it changes the message that the group understands to be true about itself in terms of value in relation to other ethnicities and cultural groups around the globe. And so when a group experiences a shared mass atrocity, it certainly, of course, causes a sense of cultural pain, this sense of shame and guilt and rejection and anger about not being accepted for how the group identifies. And we also know that then there are also changes in how a group will communicate and operate both within itself and with outgroups. And it changes the messaging that the group then passes down from generation to generation. And so we know that as a result of historical trauma, there are higher instances of depression, anxiety, anger management issues, domestic violence, substance abuse issues, and higher mortality rates. So we just know that to be fact from the research that has been done. And so when it comes to historical trauma, it's important to have an understanding not only of someone's cultural identity, but how someone's family has identified and identified in relation to some of these experiences historically. So with that, I want to show us a quick video clip. So we'll see if this will come up. We've got a different computer today than yesterday. So.
One morning I woke up and I heard my brother crying. He was screaming so loud you thought someone was dying. "Mom, Dad," he screamed, but there was no use trying. They weren't around. I ran outside and saw he'd had a pretty bad crash. His bike was in the ditch, down his arm a bloody gash. He looked so pitiful just sitting there in the dirt amongst the trash crying, "I want Mom and Dad." I picked him up and started running toward my uncle's up the way. It started raining and got real dark. You could barely tell it was day. My brother cried and asked, "Sister, where's Mom?" I didn't know what to say, when the truth is, I don't know. When my uncle saw us coming, he ran into the yard. He took my brother from me and he held him in his arms. When he saw my face, I could tell he was alarmed. And he said, "What happened? Did you fall too?" "Uncle, I'm so tired of wondering why. Why do they drink? Why do they do drugs? Why do they leave us? Why?" He said, "Sister, it's hard to explain." And I said, "Uncle, try." And then he told this story.
Once this land was teepees as far as you can see. The water was clean, the land pristine. We were where we were meant to be. Then strangers came across the sea and brought with them their disease. Our people cried and prayed and sang, but it brought them to their knees.
We will rise up from the darkness. We will overcome the pain. Warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Imagine that your family, and most of all your tribe, what if most of everyone you love suddenly got sick and died? And before you even had a chance to bury them and mourn, the strangers came and took away the land where you were born. And you wondered if your parents even cared as they stole you and your brother away, or if they'd been so beaten down they had nothing left to say. And then at school, they cut your hair and beat you if you spoke the language that Creator gave our people when earth awoke.
We will rise up from the darkness. We will overcome the pain. Warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Sister, I'm not trying to tell you that your mom and dad are okay, or that they're not responsible for the choices that they've made. But you see this bloody wound on your little brother's arm. If we don't clean it, it won't heal and it'll do all kinds of harm. Those deep wounds of our ancestors still bleed within our hearts. When we remember all they've done, that's where the healing starts. So every morning when you wake, you pray this prayer out loud. Creator, help me live in a way that would make my ancestors proud.
We will rise up from the darkness.
Don't you forget this. You can be anything you want to be.
We will overcome the pain.
Just work hard, never give up. Perseverance is the key.
Warrior spirits live within
Strength,
us.
dignity, honor, that's all in your family tree. So hold your head up high and know that.
We shall remain. We will rise up from the darkness.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
We will overcome the pain.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
Warrior spirits live
ancestors proud.
We shall remain.
Little brother, we will rise up from this darkness. Little brother, we will overcome the pain. Remember, warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
I always like to show this particular video because it not only does a phenomenal job of illustrating the impact of historical trauma, but it also shows efforts towards healing by reclaiming culture, aspects of culture lost. And so in that sense, I think it's got a really inspirational message to it. And so when we talk about historical trauma, it's important, again, to understand the impact that it has for individuals, and we want to be able to have a sense of what families have gone through and what families continue to go through. And we also want to understand that there's potential for us as individuals in the helping profession to respond inappropriately to symptoms of historical trauma. So one example of this is a study that came out of the Texas State Department of Human Services. They had done some digging into wanting to address the fact that, whoops, oh gosh, I knew that was going to happen. They wanted to address the fact that when they looked at their numbers in terms of their child protective cases statewide, what they were finding was that if they were taking temporary custody of children from parents, that if you were a white mother, you were much more likely to regain back custody of your children than if you were a black mother. And so they wanted to understand why that was. And so they did some looking into this, and they found that one of the main factors contributing to this was a child protective caseworker's perception of parenting styles about white mothers versus black mothers. And so in their study, they attributed this to a misunderstanding of historical trauma. The example being that if during times of slavery, I'm a black mother and you're my child and we live on a plantation or we have a slave owner, I am going to parent you in such a way that you are going to learn to listen to me and you are going to behave for me before I ever allow an opportunity for you to act out and be disciplined by a slave owner. So my parenting style is going to be much more harsh and less forgiving out of necessity, out of a strong desire to protect you and make sure that someone doesn't harm you any further. And so this parenting style then that has been passed down from generation to generation in present day was then being perceived as unreasonably harsh and sort of baseless, that there was no understanding as to why this parenting style might have been more harsh. And so what they decided to do in an effort to respond to this was, okay, clearly we need to diversify our staff. We'll diversify our child protective workforce, and then hopefully these disparities, this disparity will decrease. And so what they ended up doing is they worked, I think it was a 12-month process, they worked to diversify their workforce, and the outcome was the disparity got worse. And so why might that be? Why might it have gotten even worse? So maybe the opposite happened. Well, and so it got worse because historical trauma was still impacting this. So for child protective workers of color, as they started to survey and interview folks, there was this expectation of, I'm going to be harsh on mothers of color because I'm not going to have you perpetuate this negative belief about how we run our families. And so still, historical trauma impacted the outcomes for folks who were suffering historical trauma. And so I share that example to again go over the importance of understanding how this potentially impacts the work that we do and the families that we serve kind of day in and day out. So you can see this, any comments, questions about that? No. Okay, so when we talk about historical trauma, it's also important to talk about this idea of historical guilt, which is also known as white guilt. And it's the sense of guilt, shame, helplessness, and an inability to reconcile these feelings based off of looking like the people who perpetuated the mass atrocities against other groups in the past. And so historical guilt, again, white guilt, is something that's important to understand because we know that as humans, we don't like to feel guilty. It's uncomfortable, and typically we will do things to try to resolve or reduce that guilt. And so what ends up happening is sometimes these efforts to reduce the guilt will cause further harm to individuals who have experienced historical trauma. So one of the things that we see kind of on a societal level is in an effort to reduce historical guilt, we'll hear statements like, I don't know that the Holocaust really happened, or maybe it wasn't to the extent that they say it happened. So we'll hear statements about trying to reduce or question the significance of these historical mass atrocities, or we'll hear people make statements like, that happened before you were born, so that can't be your issue because you weren't alive when that happened. And so trying to dismiss someone's feelings or the validity of someone's family history and those experiences. So with historical guilt, it can then be quite dangerous if we don't acknowledge it and understand it for what it is. And so we even see on a global level, following World War II, there was a global response in terms of historical guilt with the creation of Israel, that there was this land that was allocated, this is what we're going to do in an effort to make things up to a community, and then we see kind of the residual fallout as a result of that. So with historical guilt, we again want to understand why someone might be acting the way they are. And there's also, we might see gracism is one of the things that come from someone trying to resolve this historical guilt. And we also want to understand, in relation to this idea of white fragility. Who's familiar with the term white fragility? So a couple hands. So this is really the idea that for some Caucasian people that there is an unwillingness or maybe an inability to take a look at historical guilt simply because the sense of shame or guilt is too overwhelming. And so white fragility, this concept of white fragility suggests that for white individuals that it might feel safer to avoid looking at these topics, or it might just simply feel too uncomfortable to look at these topics. And then we see folks again, not wanting to acknowledge assumptions or not wanting to acknowledge biases, those kinds of things. So it's important to have an understanding of kind of how all these things play into how people interact with one another. And in our workplaces, we then want to understand how disparities continue to exist, because we have disparate outcomes in very many fields that we find people working in. So law enforcement, primary health care, mental health and substance abuse, kind of the list goes on, the education field. We know that there are disparities, and for behavioral health and human services purposes, we know that there are disparities in who has access to services, who it is we're successfully retaining in services, and we also know that there are disparities in what the outcomes look like for folks, both short-term and long-term, based on demographics. And so we want to understand how, potentially how this exists in our workplace, because I would say for most of us in the helping professions, we work in places where there are expectations that we not act in prejudiced or discriminatory or racist ways in our workplaces. But The researchers suggest that modern day prejudice, the number one indicator of it is disparities. And so then we have to understand, well, what does this look like in our workplace then? If we have our disparities, we know we've got modern day prejudice. So how do we then identify it? And so these researchers, their names are Banaji and Greenwald. They have a book that it's cited up here, but they talk about the experience of one of their colleagues as an example of modern day prejudice. And the example is that they worked with a woman whose last name was Kaplan. She was a professor at Yale, and so everyone just kind of knew this woman, not only for being a professor, but for being a knitter. And so while she was lecturing, you would often find her knitting, or you would see her sitting in the back of a colleague's lecture hall knitting. It was just kind of her thing. And so one day, this woman was at home and washing a glass dish in her sink, and she broke it, and she cut her palm pretty severely, and she ended up at Yale New Haven Hospital. And so she talks about this experience of being in the ER, and the ER doctor starts to stitch up her palm, and he asks her, what do you do? What do you use your hands for? And she said, well, I'm a knitter. If I can't knit, I don't quite know what I'll do with myself. And he assured her that she would be fine, and he continued to stitch up her hand. And so it was about that time that a student volunteer walked through and said, Professor Kaplan, what happened to you? And the ER doc froze. And he said, Professor, are you a professor at Yale? And she said, yes. And he stopped working on her hand. He assembled a team of the best hand surgeons in the region, who then performed surgery on her hand for hours, working to connect almost every last nerve ending. And so to this day, this woman talks about having some occasional loss of sensation in her hand, and of course wonders what would this have looked like had he just continued to stitch up her hand. So they suggest that this is exactly what modern day prejudice looks like in our professional work settings, that everyone I work with is going to get my baseline level of services, and baseline is going to be good enough. But if there is something about you that I find personally compelling, something about you that I identify with, you remind me of a friend, a family member, something like that, I'm going to be more likely to go above and beyond for you. I might have a pool of referral sources that I know who I think the most effective ones are. Maybe I reserve those folks for individuals who I feel personally compelled by. Maybe I give a little more time and attention in terms of my overall caseload to some clients. Maybe I'm making statements like, I don't know what it is about this client. I just feel like if I supported them in these ways, I really think they could make it. And so when modern day prejudice is disguised in this way, it feels and looks like favoritism. And favoritism feels far less icky than prejudice, but they suggest that that's exactly what it is. And it's really quite an insidious way for prejudice to creep into the work that we do. And so for ourselves, it's important to take a look at, how do I respond to any and all clients or patients that I'm working with? If I'm a supervisor, then it's important to think, okay, how are my staff allocating time and resources to individuals on their caseload, and how are we both self-monitoring and then as an agency monitoring for how services are being provided. So again, this is how they suggest disparities continue to occur, because baseline, you can't argue that baseline isn't good enough. It is just that, though. It's just baseline. And then if there's room to improve the quality of service delivery, if we are really taking a look at how clients are qualifying for kind of an increased response, they suggest that then will help reduce disparities across the board. So questions, comments about that?
Every individual is unique and priceless.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they should be treated.
Yeah, and truly, most agencies have that very philosophy and belief, and so it's important then to know that this is sometimes how disparities continue to exist. Okay, so what I would like us to do is break up into small groups And we've got several different questions that I want folks to answer. So the first one is, I'd like you to break up into groups of maybe 3 or 4 people. And the first thing I'd like you to talk about is a time that you yourself experienced prejudice or discrimination. So, yeah, when it comes to confronting instances of discrimination, it can really depend greatly on the relationship we have with maybe the individual who perpetuated the discrimination. And so sometimes I hear maybe it's easier to talk with family and friends, and sometimes I hear I cannot talk with this family member about their views. It's, you know, it would be pointless, it would ruin the relationship. That there are a lot of things that get in the way and deter us from being able to call it out for what it is, or there's fear of retaliation, those kinds of things. So, so we go through these particular questions, certainly not in an effort to shame folks or anything like that, but really to examine how we've reacted in the past in an effort to kind of prepare ourselves for how we might react in the future. And so when we think about some of the things that perpetuate modern day prejudice in the workplace, one of the number one things is microaggressions. So microaggressions really come across as a joke or a slight. They're intended to be humorous a lot of times, where essentially what someone is doing is making fun of someone by comparing them to an entire other group of people. So some examples of microaggressions might be, oh, that's so gay, or that's so retarded, or that's so ghetto, you know, those kinds of things. So by comparing someone, again, to an entire cultural factor or identity, it's intended to be an insult. There's microaggressions about gender. We hear things like, oh, you throw like a girl, you run like a girl. And then Serena Williams has a great response where she says, yeah, if you practice really hard, you could too one day. But the intent behind that is to be insulting, right? And so microaggressions happen, and they can happen in our workplaces, and so oftentimes they'll go kind of unchecked. And so it's important when we hear a microaggression that we use it as a teachable moment, and we say, I don't understand what you mean by that. Can you explain what you mean? And by having someone have to kind of walk through exactly what they meant by a microaggression, it kind of highlights for them how it can be harmful and hurtful. So we want to be able to recognize how microaggressions kind of help to support and perpetuate modern day prejudice in the workplace. So keep going here. We talked about cultural pain earlier in relation to acculturation and assimilation and those expectations, and then we also talked about it in relation to historical trauma. But we want to understand that within our workplace, there is also a culture in and of itself. As a Hilltop employee, there is a culture around, within the facility in which you work, within the agency in which you work. And so for each and every one of us, when we choose to take a job, we're really choosing to acculturate to our workplace's sort of internal culture. So when we choose to take a job, what we do is we typically look at a job announcement, we might read the position description, we'll go on an interview, we'll get asked questions, we'll ask questions, and then when we get hired on, a lot of times people will go through a new employee orientation. So this is where you get told, okay, this is how you dress, this is when you show up, this is when you can leave, this is your sick time, so on and so forth. And we're given a lot of times the agency policies. Okay, this is our policy on workplace violence and harassment and customer care and so on and so forth. And we can then choose whether or not we want to stay in this workplace culture. We can say, okay, this fits for me and my values and what I'm interested in, or this doesn't. And so our clients, our patients, don't have that same luxury sometimes. So working in behavioral health and human services, sometimes folks come to us because they're court ordered, or they'll come to us because their insurance dictates where they can go, or they'll come to us maybe because there are limited resources in town and we're really the only ones who can provide a specific service. And so they don't necessarily get the opportunity or the ability to say, hey, this agency's practices and environment and culture works for me or not. They're just sort of left with, this is your option. And so we want to recognize that there is then inherently a power differential in our workplace culture, that we have power over our clients simply because we're the ones providing the services. Sometimes we're the ones making recommendations about what's going to be most appropriate for them, what they're eligible for, and kind of so on and so forth. And so with that agency workplace culture, we want to again examine ways in which our agency is as welcoming as possible, or things that could be done to make our agency more inclusive and kind of take into consideration that power differential. And so with that, that kind of lends itself to us talking about privilege. And so typically in the 4-hour training, we will do a long activity about this, but I just want to show you a quick.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on a faucet. That's privilege.
If you have ever tried to change your speech, if you were embarrassed about your clothes or house, if you would never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs.
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over.
I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in and the job I get to do and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just a gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you have ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you are able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house growing up. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on. It was very awkward.
I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted, and as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately, and we all it was just silent.
Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege, like, oh, but that's not actually me, because like I had to work really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward with someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how those things were hard.
It was like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like, this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me, and realizing that, you know, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap.
It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there were questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. You know, we're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have.
It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good, my parents did good, and I'll do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
So again, typically we would show, or we would do an activity around assessing for our own individual levels of privilege related to any number, again, of cultural factors like race, ethnicity, religious privilege, sexual orientation privilege, gender identity privilege, socioeconomic status privilege. The list, of course, goes on. And so it's important to understand that with privilege, a lot of times, and again, because our cultural identity factors can change over time, those various levels of privilege can also change over time. And so I show this particular slide because this is Patrick Stewart, who was on Star Trek, and he talks about as a young boy, his father was a prominent member of the community, and he remembers a lot of instances where his father would perpetrate domestic violence against his mother, and he remembers law enforcement showing up and law enforcement saying to his mom, "What did you do this time? Why can't you behave yourself? You know, what did you do to make him angry this time?" And so he remembers that because of his father's level of privilege and social standing in the community, he wasn't held accountable. And so now he likes to advocate for Amnesty International and recognizes that as an older white man, he's got quite a bit of privilege. And so when it comes to determining our own level of privilege and power, we again want to consider how that exists in our workspace simply because of the position that you're in as a professional working with the clients that you're serving. So when it comes to being culturally competent, we sometimes have unrealistic expectations of ourselves in regards to what that really means. So the numbers up here on this slide, the 6.5 billion represents the worldwide population as of 2010. And then the second number, the 8,000 plus, represents the number of known cultures and subcultures as they are studied in the field of anthropology. So what we know about anthropology is you might study one culture or subculture for the entirety of your career, and at the end of it, you might be proficient in the nuances of that culture. The 5,000 to 6,000 up there represents the number of known languages and dialects currently used worldwide, and we know that language is a huge sustainer and contributor to culture. And then that last number represents you as your happy hilltop employee trying to be culturally competent and trying to be responsive to each and every individual that you might be serving during your time as a, in the work that you do. And so if we were to think about cultural competency in terms of knowing most things about most cultures that we might encounter, we would be setting ourselves up for failure simply because it's not possible. We would have to be mini anthropologists in very many combinations of cultures. And what we also know is that when we have general information about cultures and beliefs, that we can then unintentionally apply those generalizations to individuals, and it may or may not be true for them anyway. So when it comes to being culturally competent, it becomes quite simple in that we want to gather the information from an individual or from a family so that we have the most accurate picture of what's most important within someone's cultural identity. So being culturally competent really boils down to three things. So doing three things pretty regularly, and we've talked about some of them already this morning. So one of those three things that SAMHSA suggests we need to do to be culturally competent is acknowledge our assumptions and biases, which we talked about earlier, open ourselves up to information that challenges our assumptions and biases, and three, be willing and open to learn new information about the cultural, the important cultural factors of other individuals, that we open ourselves up to receiving that information. So if we're doing those three things on a regular basis, we are likely conducting ourselves in a culturally competent manner. So in that sense, being culturally competent becomes quite simple. And so we just want to be sure to conceptualize it in a way that we're capable of doing it. So, okay, we don't have a lot of time here, and I apologize because I was hoping to get through more of these slides. But in the interest of time, one of the things that I want to touch on is the national class standards. So The national class standards are the culturally and linguistically appropriate services standards. They're put forth by the Office of Minority Health. And so, for grants that come from the feds and for all grants that come through SAMHSA, which you may or may not operate within some of those, but there's now a requirement that agencies complete a disparities impact statement if they're receiving federal grant funds. Our office has to do it for the federal block grant and for the system of care grant, kind of so on and so forth. And so the national class standards really serve as a set of 15 standards that, that the Office of Minority Health and SAMHSA would hope that agencies would follow in an effort to organizationally become more culturally responsive. So these standards are broken down into 3 different themes, and we have trainings on the standards alone. But the first set of standards talks about workforce governance and training, and so really encouraging agencies to think about things that you could be doing organizationally to improve cultural responsiveness. So how are you setting expectations for being culturally competent in your job announcements, in your position descriptions? Are you asking questions about this in job interviews? In supervision, is this something that you're monitoring for? In your performance evaluations, is this something that you're assessing for employees periodically or annually? How are you training employees, which I know Hilltop likes to do an annual training. So how are you training employees? And then how are you working this into your vision statement, your mission statement? How are you reviewing agency policies and procedures to see, what it is you do to be as responsive as possible? The second section of the class standards talks about language and communication assistance. So what are you doing in terms of interpretive services, translating documents? How are you determining who's an appropriate interpreter? Are you refraining from having family members or friends interpret for clients? Are you refraining from pulling in employees who may be able to communicate in 2 or more languages, but you haven't yet assessed for their level of proficiency? And so how are you assuring that clients are getting the accurate information they need in regards to medical terms or mental health terms, those kinds of things? And then the last section of these standards talks about continuous quality improvement. So what are you doing in terms of how you collect data about your clients, and how are you collecting demographic information, and then how are you analyzing that data to inform yourselves about who it is you're retaining successfully in services, what do the outcomes look like across demographics, and are you then using that information to inform a quality improvement plan? How are you gathering feedback from consumers about their experiences in during their time with your agency, those kinds of things. So these standards are a great way for agencies to kind of structure themselves around any improvements you want to make with regards to cultural competency. I'm always happy to talk with folks about that. So again, in the interest of time, I know we are at 11 o'clock, and I know that Hilltop has a quick performance that they want you to see in honor of September as National Hispanic Heritage Month. But any final comments, questions? Again, I apologize for not getting through the additional slides that we have, but I want to give a few minutes in case folks have questions.
chinita, qué maldito gavilán. Ay, ay, chinita, no te vayas a enamorar. Qué bonito gavilán con sus alitas plateadas, pero más bonitas son las solteras y casadas. Qué bonito gavilán con sus alitas plateadas, pero más bonitas son las solteras y casadas. Ay, 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 chinita, qué maldito gavilán. Ay, 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 chinita, no te vayas a enamorar. Ay, 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 chinita, qué maldito gavilán. Ay, 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 chinita, no te vayas